Good evening. This is Mr. Wintermelon. In the previous video, you have learned about the anatomy of a heart. So you have learned about the chamber as well as the vessel. This will help equip you with the sufficient knowledge to know which part of the heart that I'm referring to in today's lesson, which is on cardiac cycle. Cardiac cycle basically refers to what happens when a heart beats. So the objective of this lesson is for you to learn the outline of a cardiac cycle in terms of what happened during systole and diastole. What are systole and diastole? This is where we are about to find out. So during a cardiac cycle, it is a sequence of contraction and relaxation of atria and ventricles. It consists of systole and diastole. Systole is the contraction of the cardiac muscle, while diastole is the relaxation. They may be divided into three phases, which we will find out soon. Now, an easy way of remembering which one is contraction and which one is relaxation is remember S for systole, S is also for squeeze. Squeeze start with S, so systole squeezes the blood out from the heart. So systole is the contraction. Then diastole is the reverse, which is relaxation. So let us start with our cardiac cycle. Even though that I said that there are three phases, you will see 4 parts down here. Just keep in mind that the first part and the last part, they actually belongs to the same phase. I just like to start teaching when the blood is passively filling the ventricle. So this happened during the late ventricular diastole. At this stage, both the ventricles and the atrial are relaxed. So they are not pushing the blood to any place. Therefore, as the blood is entering the atrial through the pulmonary vein or the vena cava, the blood will enter the atrium and then the blood will directly flow passively into the ventricle. Passively means that the muscle of the heart or the cardiac muscle is not pushing the blood into the ventricle. So they just flow into the ventricle passively. After this stage, the atrium will start to contract. So we call this stage the atrial systole. When this happens, both the atrial will contract, forcing all the blood to pass through the AV valves into the relaxed ventricles. So you can see that the shape of the atrium is different. So the atrial will contract and push all the blood into the ventricle in this stage. Very simple. Atrial contract. So after the blood have flown into the ventricle will start to contract. When this happens, the contraction of the ventricle will cause the AV valves to close. This will cause a loud sound. What is the loud sound that I'm referring to? Now, if you have your mother lying around or any willing participant lying around, seek permission first to put your head in front of their chest and try to listen to their heartbeat, and you will hear the sound of loud duck, loud duck, loud duck. So this is the loud sound that you will hear. This loud sound is due to the closure of the ventricle. Then the duck sound is due to closure of another valve, which you will learn later on. After the AV valve is closed, the atria will start to relax and is refilled with blood from the pulmonary vein or the vena cava. So the ventricles will continue to contract and the pressure in the ventricle will build up and eventually it will exceed the pressure of the aorta or the pulmonary artery. So when the pressure exceeds the aorta or pulmonary artery, the semilunar valve will be forced open by the pressure, and the blood will flow out from the heart to the rest of our body or to our lung. So this should be quite simple to understand. When the pressure is lower than the aorta or the pulmonary artery, the pressure from those arteries will force the semilunar valve down. And during ventricular systole, the ventricle will contract, causing the pressure to build up, and eventually the pressure will exceed that of the arteries, and the blood will be pumped out of the heart. Lastly is the early ventricular diastole. So this last stage and the first stage, or the stage 0 which I mentioned, is actually considered one stage. So during the early ventricular relaxation, the ventricle will relax. And when this happens, the pressure will drop. And when the pressure falls below that of the pressure in the arteries, the semilunar valves will close, causing the dap sound. So, lap dap is caused by the closing of valves inside the heart. As I mentioned earlier, the atrial will start to be refilled by blood from the vein. And when the pressure in the atrial exceeds that of the ventricle, the AV valves will open and the blood will flow passively from the atrial to the ventricle, and the cycle will continue. Now let us take a look at the best GIF that you can find on the internet on the cardiac cycle. Because I have slowed down this GIF to a much more manageable speed so that you can better appreciate this cardiac cycle. Like I mentioned, I like to start with the passive filling of the ventricle first. So please shift our attention to the GIF. Right now you can see the passive filling. After that, the atrium will contract, pushing all the blood to the ventricle. Ventricle will contract, closing the AV valve. And when the pressure of the ventricle is higher than that of the artery, the blood will be forced out into the two arteries. So ventricle will contract, semilunar valve will open, and the blood will flow into the arteries. And again, you can watch the animation again. Atrial contract, ventricle contract, closing the AV valve. And the closure of valve is to prevent the backflow of blood into the atrium. So let me repeat the sequence of event again. Passive filling of ventricle, then the atrium will contract. This will cause rest of the blood to flow into the ventricle. Then during ventricular systole, your ventricle contract, and this contraction of muscle will cause pressure to build up, and when the pressure of the ventricle is higher than that of the atrial, it will close the AV valve. As pressure continues to build up, it will exceed that of the artery, then the blood will be forced out from the ventricle into the artery to be delivered to the rest of our body or into our lung. After the ventricle have finished contraction, it will start its relaxation, and pressure will fall, causing the valve to, or semilunar valve to close. And when the ventricle pressure is below that of the atrium, the AV valve will open and passively fills the ventricle with blood again, and so the cycle will continue. Okay, some disclaimer here. If you really don't understand this part of the lesson, then just remember when does each of the valve closes and when does each of the valve open. You can see a simplified version of this inside your biology textbook. So this is the change of pressure in the heart or in the left side of the heart, which is why you only have the aorta as well as the left atrium and the left ventricle pressure. So first of all, some legend. The blue color dotted line is the change in pressure in the left atrium. The black color line represents the change in pressure inside the left ventricle. And lastly, the red color dotted line represents the change in pressure of the aorta. Like always, I like to start with the passive filling of the ventricle. At this point of time, all the valves are actually open. After this, the left atrium will contract, forcing all the blood into the left ventricle. When this happens, the left atrium pressure will obviously increase, while the left ventricle, because blood is being forced into it, the pressure will also increase. After the increase, the pressure will drop because all the blood have been squeezed into the ventricle already. Then your ventricle will contract, and as the pressure builds up, it will force the AV valve to close. And in a short while, as the pressure continues to rise, it will force open the semilunar valve, causing the blood to flow into the aorta. So you can see from the diagram, as the blood pressure of the ventricle exceeds that of the aorta, the semilunar valve will open. Later on, after all the blood have been pushed out into the aorta, the ventricle will start to relax and you can see its pressure dropping. So when the pressure drops below that of the aorta, or the red color dotted line, the semilunar valve will close. And when the pressure of the ventricle is lower than that of the atrium, or the black color line is lower than that of the blue color dotted line, the AV valve will open again, starting this cycle all over again with the passive filling of the atrium as well as ventricle. But of course, just keep in mind the filling of the atrium has already started during the ventricular systole when the AV valve closes. So this will be the end for this lesson. I strongly advise you to rewatch this again because it might not be so easy to get the first time off. And if you want, you can always slow down the speed of this video into half the speed while watching the GIF earlier on.